Welcome back to Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. Our last episode included special guest Cristin Dorgelo, a former senior advisor at the Office of Management and Budget and an amazing expert on the federal workforce ecosystem, to talk about reductions in force that we're seeing in the federal workforce. We had a lot more to explore for our listeners on the context and consequences of RIFs, which are both unprecedented in approach and also an impact. Let's dive in again on what we may see in terms of the impact over the coming months, and more hopefully, how we might use this as a springboard for future reform. So just some overarching context for folks as we go into the second part of the conversation. Reductions in force have been a tool that presidents and administrations have used in a number of different ways over the decades. This runs from anything in the post-World War II context. President Truman used an approach similar to this in order to cut the size of the federal workforce, to a much smaller version that was not actually, to get rid of the folks that were not actually needed in a post-war context. And that was upwards in the millions of people. So in the same way that we had military demobilization, we also had federal workforce demobilization to a degree. We've also seen a number of other approaches that different presidents have used. That includes anything from President Eisenhower did a reduction of around 200,000 positions, as well as downsizing the military. That came out of recommendations from the Hoover Commission. President Ford proposed the elimination of about 40,000 positions following the 1973 recession. Ronald Reagan, famous for not exactly being a huge fan of the federal government and federal workforce, he attempted to eliminate 50,000 roles, but also increased the federal workforce by 95,000 personnel. So not quite the math that he had anticipated. And then a story that more folks may be familiar with more recently, President Clinton reduced the federal workforce by a little over 300,000 people in a long, deeply planned process across DOD, General Services Administration, Interior, Energy, and Agriculture. Some of those were RIFs, some of those were buyouts, but it was part of a big overarching plan on remaking government that has actually gotten quite a bit of criticism over the past few years, based on the premise that the folks that were cut were the wrong people. The people that we needed the most, the people that were most valuable in the federal government, were often the ones who were cut in the context of President Clinton's downsizing of government work. So we wanted to continue the conversation with Cristin around the impacts that we see not only to the day-to-day workforce and how agencies operate, but the actual impact that we see for the country overall. Let's go back to the conversation. So these cuts, as we've been talking about, they come on top of all the other cuts of probationary employees, the folks who took early retirement, the folks who were eliminated as part of the getting rid of U.S. Agency for International Development. Are we starting to see, or when do you think we're going to start to see actual mission impact in terms of government offering fewer services or slower services, or doing what Radha called the government version of quiet quitting? Can they actually just do less? And is that actually starting to happen at this point?
It's absolutely starting to happen. It's helpful to think about all of this attrition and these layoffs in context, not in a vacuum. And I see them in two different categories. In one category, the administration is going after agencies and laying off staff and agencies it's intending to close, ahead of even working with Congress to agree with Congress that that agency should close and that funding shouldn't be spent. So in agencies like USAID or the Institute for Museum and Library Services, you're seeing a move to a layoff, which means all activities of that agency are ceasing ahead of even consulting with Congress, right? And what happens then is that it's one tactic in withholding funds, and it's a real quick way to do it. Mm-hmm. At IMLS, you saw, which is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, they put most of those staff on leave, including all but 4 of those who knew how to manage grants. When you do that, what happens? Grants stop flowing to libraries and museums, period, right? When you let every single person at USAID go, what happens? Life-saving aid doesn't get delivered. It's a very fast way to dismantle an agency with or without Congress, and in this case, without. But in other agencies, the changes are a little harder to see where they're coming from, right? Because at the Department of Health and Human Services or Agriculture or Housing and Urban Development, you're not trying to close the agency if you're this administration. You're just trying to make some really big changes. And so what you get is compounding effect of layoffs, firings, resignations, and retirements, totally disconnected from mission or plan. And then attrition that's so much deeper, even than the administration intended in certain areas, that they're having to again rehire. So it's CDC rehiring hundreds of employees so that schools can deal with hazardous levels of lead poisoning, and monitoring wildfire smoke and taking care of coal miners. The administration didn't actually mean to cut those programs, or if they did, they walked back from them pretty quickly when they got some pressure from Congress. And again, here we are trying to clean up that mess. And we're only 6 months in. This to me just demonstrates a real lack of understanding what it means to meet agency missions. And like, we are the people feeling that, right? Those schools, those coal miners, the people in the areas suffering from wildfire smoke are the ones who are to suffer if we don't actually succeed in keeping those experts aboard.
This is something that's been on my mind a lot for the past few months, that yes, the administration has attempted to end contracts, cut off grants and other things in a much more explicit way. But by eliminating federal workers and federal capacity, it's the same sort of policy choice. Even if they didn't write it down as, I'm getting rid of this program, by getting rid of the workers that are actually leading this, it has the exact same effect. So you can't separate out the overall impact and the relationship between the two. But something else I've been worried about, because we don't need more these days, is how does this impact the federal government's ability to actually retain the existing workforce that it needs, but also to, at some point, I assume it's going to have to recruit additional folks to come in as new opportunities come up. Might it impact its ability to recruit the workforce we need in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about how chaotic and unpredictable this has been, but it's also embedded with messaging and a mood, vibes that are really disrespectful and at times immoral and disconnected from thoughtful plans about how to be effective. Delivering agency missions are a large part of why people choose to work in the federal government, right? They want to make their nation, their communities better. And so when you don't have you don't have that care, you don't have that respect, that is going to harm not just retention of current employees, but recruitment of new ones. The number of rock star civil servants I know who are choosing to leave government now, the number of people coming out of great training programs that are choosing not to apply is sobering. And that scope and scale then can't be ignored. So if you were an early career expert in technology or service design or policy, these skills the government needs, and you had an option of serving in the federal government right now, or looking at a role in the private sector or state and local government, I mean, there are many arguments you would turn away from federal service. I don't know about you, but that would be a hard choice for me to make. We hate bad managers, all of us. This is like another level. Imagine if the federal government as a whole was open for glass door reviews right now. Like, how brutal would that be? And all you got to do is look at Federal News subreddit to see how bad it has gotten for federal workers in their day-to-day experience. Like, it's hard to put that amount of actual trauma into context. This is going to have generational impacts. I don't think that's an overstatement.
And maybe to end us on a slightly positive note, sort of harkening back to the
Good luck
conversation.
with that, Radha.
I'm trying. I'm like digging up. As we think about the government workforce of the future that we need, and we see, frankly, decimation of the current workforce, how do we think about turning this into an opportunity to reset how we approach talent acquisition, both the messaging, as you rightly know, the management, but also the talent? Is there an opportunity here to reshape how we approach talent acquisition?
Boy, we could have a whole follow-up conversation just on this question. And I'm a big believer that there's, so much room for improvement in how the government thinks about taking advantage, not just of hiring authorities they do have now, which is a lot, flexibilities they do have now, it's a lot, but other practices for recruiting top talent and then retaining those. We've got a really competitive national marketplace for good people. I think that when I think about the future of government workforce, I want the government to be a place where people can both find lifelong careers, where it's right for them, and where career pathways really benefit from that deep expertise internal to government. But I also want government to be a place where great people can come for a shorter stint or a tour as part of a broader career, because that flexibility, that permeability is really helpful to having the best practices show up in the government's work. I'm an example of somebody who first came into government because there was a flexible fellowship authority that allowed experts to come into the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to serve for a tour, maybe a year, maybe several. I was mid-career, I was well paid, I was thriving in a West Coast nonprofit, but that authority made it attractive for me to come aboard because of that time limitation and how I could be paid, and also the mission. And here I am, 13 years later, having done 2 tours of service in the federal government and still working on these issues of government capacity. It's a very exciting place to work if we give more people a chance to experience it, a chance to make a big impact that changes the lives of a lot of people. And we need a system that reflects that flexibility and that permeability, but also values the internal expertise, the careers that center public service and mission, and the public's interest. This can't be run like a corporation. The nature of the work is different, but we've got 80% of federal workers across the country. If that they are thriving and the government is a model employer, it can have ripple effects for employment nationwide and how workers are treated. So I am optimistic, even while I am nervous about the foundation here really getting eroded. I think there are opportunities to build back and revitalize that workforce in a way that will be constructive.
Radha, I was skeptical that we could pull off a more optimistic end, but we managed to get there. I will say that one of the things that we try to do in these podcasts is try to dispel myths around the systems that we work within. And one of them that I run into over and over again is, do people actually want to serve in government? Do young people in particular, but also people who are in a number of high demand fields, do they actually want to serve in the government? And my answer is, no matter how hard we've made it for them in the past, the answer is yes. We have far too many applications to actually review in many cases. And we've put up so many hurdles for people to be able to serve. And with that, you have all these fascinating entry points. Cristin, you had your amazing story of coming in, but Radha, you were, I think, an academic who ended up in Afghanistan somehow.
Correct.
And then I think an IPA, and then a political appointee.
Yep.
Which is not at all a traditional, but also very normal to encounter career path. I was a PM, presidential management fellow, a career appointee, and then came in later as a political. And all of us encountered in that just incredibly talented individuals who wanted to find a way to find a way to make public service work for them. So Cristin, yes, we could have probably another 3 hours of conversation on where can we go from here. And I know we'll come back to it, but I so appreciate you joining for this. This was amazing, both depressing, but also really, really interesting in terms of what should be happening, what is happening day to day. So I hope we can have you back another time.
Would love that. And thanks for your interest in this.